There are deaths, and then there are erasures. The end of a life is a biological fact, but the end of a legacy, the deliberate and violent annihilation of a man's place in history, is an act of political art. On November 24th, 1326, in the city of Hereford, a man named Hugh Despenser the Younger was subjected not to a mere execution, but to a meticulously choreographed ritual of deconstruction. He was to be taken apart, piece by piece, in front of a baying crowd, his body scattered to the winds. This was not simply punishment. It was a state-sanctioned exorcism. The question that hangs over the scaffold, reeking of blood and burning entrails, is not why he was killed, but why his death had to be a public spectacle of anatomical and symbolic destruction. How does a man, even a hated one, become so toxic that the kingdom believes it can only be cleansed by unmaking him entirely, ensuring not even a complete corpse remains to haunt the land he once ruled? The answer lies in the terrifying truth of his power. Hugh Despenser was not executed for breaking the law. He was executed for having become the law itself. To understand the monstrous edifice of Hugh Despenser's power, one must first understand the hollow crown it was built upon. King Edward II of England was a man tragically unsuited for the brutal demands of medieval kingship. Where his father, the formidable Edward I, had been a warrior and a lawmaker, a man of iron who bent the realm to his vision, Edward II was a man of private passions and public indifference. He recoiled from the bloody business of war and the tedious administration of justice, finding solace instead in pursuits deemed unkingly, rustic hobbies, swimming, and most dangerously, the intense, exclusive affections he bestowed upon a succession of male favorites. The barons of England, a proud and predatory class of men who saw the king as the first among equals, watched with growing alarm. They had already dealt with one such favorite, Piers Gaveston, whose arrogance and access to the king had led to civil war and his own summary execution. Gaveston's death was meant to be a lesson to the king, a brutal tutorial in the limits of royal prerogative. It was a lesson Edward II tragically failed to learn. Into this volatile environment stepped Hugh Despenser the Younger. He was not, like Gaveston, an upstart of relatively humble origins. He was a product of the very class that policed the monarchy. His father, Hugh Despenser the Elder, was a respected, if ambitious, nobleman who had served both the king and his father. The younger Hugh was well-educated, a skilled administrator, and a formidable knight. He was married to Eleanor de Clare, the king's own niece, a granddaughter of the great Edward I. On the surface, he was everything the court could want. Well-connected, competent, and blue-blooded. He was not an outsider clawing his way in. He was an insider with an insatiable hunger to consume the entire system from within. His ambition was not merely to be near power, but to wield it, to absorb it, to become indistinguishable from the royal authority he was meant to serve. His initial entry into the king's inner circle was quiet, almost insidious. Appointed as the king's chamberlain in 1318, he gained the one commodity that mattered above all others: proximity. The chamberlain controlled access to the king's private person. Every petition, every whispered word, every request for favor had to pass through him. He became the gatekeeper to the king's mind and, by extension, the kingdom's treasury and its laws. The bond between Edward and Hugh quickly deepened into something far more profound and perilous than that of a king and his servant. It was a relationship of obsessive dependency. Edward, insecure and isolated, found in Despenser a man who not only validated his choices, but actively encouraged his detachment from the burdens of rule. Despenser, in turn, found in the king a perfect vessel, an instrument through which his own ambition could be given the unassailable legitimacy of the crown. The first true tremor of the earthquake to come was felt in 1321. Despenser's greed, now amplified by royal power, had become brazen. He used his influence to accumulate vast estates, particularly in the Welsh marches, strong-arming his neighbors and rivals with a combination of legal chicanery and outright threats. The Marcher lords, among the most powerful and independent magnates in the realm, saw the existential threat he posed. They united with other disaffected barons, including the powerful Thomas of Lancaster, the king's cousin, in a coalition aimed at one thing: the removal of the Despensers, father and son. They raised their armies in what became known as the Despenser War, forcing a humiliated Edward II to formally exile his favorites from the kingdom. For a brief moment, it seemed the system had worked. The nobility had checked the overreach of a corrupt courtier and restored a semblance of balance. It was, however, a false dawn. This exile was the critical turning point, the moment that transformed Hugh Despenser from a merely avaricious courtier into an engine of pure vengeance. Forced to flee, his pride wounded and his power stripped away, he did not learn humility. He learned hatred. He saw the barons not as a legitimate political force, but as traitors who had defied his will, and by extension, the king's. King Edward, for his part, was enraged by the humiliation. The exile of Despenser was a personal affront, a severing of a vital emotional bond. He mustered his forces, and in a surprising display of military resolve, he met the rebellious barons at the Battle of Barbridge in 1322. The rebellion was crushed. Thomas of Lancaster, the most powerful man in England after the king, was captured and subjected to a hasty, humiliating execution. The lesson was clear: the opposition was broken. With his enemies dead or scattered, Edward II recalled the Despensers from exile. But the man who returned was not the same one who had left. The brief check on his power had been utterly destroyed, and with it, any semblance of restraint. The period from 1322 to 1326 became known simply as the tyranny. It was no longer a matter of a favorite influencing the king. It was the reign of Hugh Despenser the Younger, with the King of England as his chief functionary. The government of England was systematically subverted and turned into a private enrichment scheme for one man and his family. A miasma of fear descended upon the realm. Despenser's methods were a masterclass in autocratic control. He and his father took control of every lever of the state. The treasury became their personal bank account. The justice system became their weapon. They instituted a program of mass extortion, targeting the widows and heiresses of the defeated rebels. Women were forced to sign away their inheritances under duress, handing over vast swathes of land and wealth to the Despensers in exchange for their freedom or their lives. A network of spies, known as the King's Eyes, was established, reporting any sign of dissent. Men were imprisoned without trial on the slightest suspicion, their lands forfeited to the Despenser coffers. Writs and pardons, the very instruments of royal grace, were sold to the highest bidder. Despenser's personal fortune ballooned to an obscene degree, making him wealthier than any other earl in the kingdom. He was not just a powerful nobleman. He was a state within the state, a parasite that was draining the lifeblood of the host. His control over the king was now absolute. Edward seemed to have retreated entirely into a world of private concerns, leaving the grim business of governing to the man he trusted so implicitly. Courtiers learned that to gain the king's ear, they first had to pay homage, and often a hefty fee, to his chamberlain. Ambassadors from foreign powers reported with astonishment that it was Despenser, not the king, who dictated policy. He held the privy seal, allowing him to issue orders in the king's name without the king even being present. He had, in effect, privatized the monarchy. The king was a symbol, a rubber stamp for the insatiable will of his favorite. This arrangement created a profound constitutional crisis, even if no one dared name it as such. If the king's will was law, but the king's will was now dictated by Hugh Despenser, then Hugh Despenser was the law. And for those who fell foul of him, there was no appeal to a higher authority, because there was none. Nowhere was Despenser's cruelty and strategic ruthlessness more apparent than in his treatment of Queen Isabella. Isabella of France, the she-wolf of later legend, was at this point a long-suffering and deeply wronged wife. For years, she had endured her husband's neglect and his flagrant favoritism. With Despenser's rise, her situation deteriorated from personal humiliation to political castration. Despenser saw her not just as the king's neglected spouse, but as a potential rival, a separate center of power and loyalty within the court. He moved systematically to isolate and disempower her. In 1324, using the pretext of a war with her native France, Despenser persuaded the king to seize all of Isabella's lands and assets. Her household was drastically reduced, her loyal French servants dismissed, and, in the most crushing blow of all, her children were effectively taken from her custody and placed under the control of the Despenser's allies. This was a calculated act of political terror, designed to break her spirit and render her utterly dependent and powerless. It was a profound miscalculation. Despenser, in his arrogance, failed to understand the woman he was dealing with. He had stripped her of her wealth, her influence, and her children, but in doing so, he had also stripped her of anything left to lose. He had transformed a neglected queen into a determined enemy, a woman who now had a single, all-consuming purpose: the destruction of Hugh Despenser and the reclamation of her son's birthright. The psychological toll of Despenser's regime was immense, not just on the queen, but on the entire nation. The court became a nest of sycophants and spies, where honest counsel was impossible and fear was the currency of daily life. The paranoia of the ruler became the reality of the ruled. Despenser, aware of the hatred he inspired, grew ever more suspicious, ever more brutal in his suppression of perceived threats. He was trapped in a cycle of his own making. His tyranny bred enemies, and the existence of enemies justified even greater tyranny. The opportunity for Isabella's revenge came, as it so often does, disguised as a diplomatic mission. In 1325, she was sent to France to negotiate a peace treaty with her brother, King Charles IV. Despenser, in a moment of supreme hubris, allowed it. Perhaps he believed she was too broken to be a threat. Perhaps he simply wanted her out of the way. Once in Paris, free from his suffocating control, Isabella made her move. She publicly refused to return to England as long as Hugh Despenser remained at the king's side. She issued a powerful statement, declaring herself a wronged wife and mother, fleeing a man who had usurped her husband's honor and threatened her life. This was a masterstroke of propaganda. She was no longer just a political player. She was a sympathetic victim, a figurehead for all the discontent seething back in England. In Paris, she found a crucial ally, Roger Mortimer. Mortimer was one of the most powerful marcher lords who had fought in the Despenser War. Captured and imprisoned in the Tower of London, he had managed a daring escape and fled to France. He was everything Edward II was not, a brilliant and ruthless military commander. He and Isabella became lovers, their personal passion fueling a shared political ambition. They began to gather support, recruiting a small army of exiled nobles and mercenaries. Their cause was framed not as a rebellion against the king, but as a righteous quest to liberate him from his evil counselor. It was a fiction, but a potent one. Back in England, Edward and Despenser could only watch with a mixture of disbelief and fury. They issued demands for her return, which were ignored. They tried to pressure the French king, who supported his sister. Despenser, for the first time in years, was facing a crisis he could not control through domestic intimidation. On September 24th, 1326, Isabella and Mortimer landed on the coast of Suffolk with their small invasion force. The result was not the bloody civil war Despenser might have anticipated, but a near total collapse of his regime. The kingdom did not rise to defend its king. It rose to welcome its liberator. The years of pent-up hatred for Despenser erupted. Nobles who had chafed under his rule, churchmen he had extorted, commoners who had lived in fear, they all flocked to Isabella's banner. The city of London, a hotbed of anti-Despenser sentiment, descended into anarchy. A mob seized and summarily beheaded one of Despenser's key allies, the Bishop of Exeter, and lynched his father, Hugh the Elder, in Bristol. The carefully constructed edifice of fear and control crumbled in a matter of days. The end, when it came, was pathetic and swift. Edward and Despenser, accompanied by a few remaining loyalists, fled London in a panic. They made for the west, hoping to find refuge and raise an army on Dispenser's vast estates in Wales, the very heartland of his power. But the loyalty he had bought with wealth and terror proved to be worthless. The Welsh, too, turned against him. Hunted and increasingly desperate, the king and his favorite were reduced to fugitives in their own kingdom. For weeks, they dodged their pursuers, their royal prestige dissolving in the autumn rains. Finally, on November 16, 1326, near Llantrisant in South Wales, they were found. There was no final stand, no heroic battle. They were discovered hiding in a wood, cold, hungry, and utterly defeated. The man who had been the de facto king of England was now a captive, his fate sealed. The journey to Hereford, where Dispenser was to be tried and executed, was a calculated ritual of humiliation. He was dressed in shabby clothes, and the crowd was encouraged to mock and jeer him. He was forced to ride on a miserable nag, with trumpeters proclaiming his crimes at every town they passed. His trial, presided over by Roger Mortimer and other enemies, was a legal farce. There was no question of guilt or innocence. The verdict had been decided the moment Isabella landed. A long list of charges was read out, accusing him of treason, of encroaching royal power, of stealing from the king, of cruelty to the queen, and of engineering the death of Thomas of Lancaster. He was declared a traitor and a heretic. According to the chronicles, Dispenser was denied the right to speak in his own defense. When the sentence of death was read, he reportedly let out a great, inhuman shriek of despair. What followed was the climax of the political theater, an event designed to be seared into the national memory. Hugh Dispenser the Younger was dragged to the public gallows outside Hereford. A massive crowd had gathered, eager for the bloody spectacle. First, he was stripped naked, and his crimes were written on his skin for all to see, a final degradation before the physical deconstruction began. He was tied to a ladder, raised high for the crowd's viewing pleasure. A great fire was lit nearby. He was hanged, the traditional punishment for a common thief, but was cut down while still alive, gasping for air. This was crucial. He had to be conscious for what came next. The executioner approached with a knife. While the crowd watched, he was publicly castrated. This was not a standard part of the punishment for treason. It was a specific symbolic act. It was a statement against his perceived unnatural influence over the king, a brutal severing of the bond that had corrupted the throne and, in the eyes of his enemies, threatened the natural order of the royal family. Then, still alive, he was disemboweled. The executioner sliced open his abdomen, pulled out his entrails and his heart, and threw them into the fire. The symbolism was as stark as the act itself. As a traitor, his heart was deemed false and corrupt. It had to be burned. His bowels, seen as the seat of his wicked counsel and avarice, were purged from the world by fire, even as he was forced to watch. It was a visceral exorcism, the physical removal of the evil from his body. Only after this unimaginable agony was he granted the mercy of death. His head was cut from his body. The ordeal was over, but the desecration was not. His corpse was not to be buried. His head was sent to be displayed on a spike on London Bridge, a grisly warning to the capital that had so hated him. His body was then quartered, and the 4 pieces were sent to be displayed in 4 other major cities across England: Bristol, Dover, York, and Newcastle. This final act was the ultimate realization of the execution's purpose. It was the complete and total erasure of the man. By denying him a grave, his enemies denied him a place of memory, a focal point for any potential sympathy or future veneration. He was not to be a martyr. He was to be an absence, a scattered collection of rotting parts whose only purpose was to serve as a testament to the terrible price of his ambition. His physical body was dismembered and dispersed, just as his vast network of power and wealth had been dismantled. The execution was a mirror of his reign, a public, violent, and total takeover, followed by a complete and utter deconstruction. The kingdom had been purged not just of a man, but of a political disease. The immediate aftermath of this brutal spectacle was a swift and decisive consolidation of power. With Dispenser and his father dead, the path was clear. A parliament was convened, and King Edward II, now a broken and friendless prisoner, was formally deposed in favor of his young son, Edward III. The articles of deposition cited his incompetence, his favoritism, and his subjugation of the kingdom to the will of the Despensers. In reality, he was deposed for having allowed Despenser to rule. The true power now rested with Queen Isabella and her lover, Roger Mortimer, who would rule as regents for the young king. Edward II himself would not last the year. He was moved to Berkeley Castle, where he died under deeply mysterious circumstances, almost certainly murdered on the orders of the new regime, which could not risk him becoming a rallying point for a counter-revolution. The cycle of violence, set in motion by Despenser's rise, continued to turn. The Despenser lands and fortune, the great prize for which so much blood had been shed, were largely absorbed by Roger Mortimer, who quickly began to exhibit the same arrogance and greed that had been Despenser's downfall. The new regime, born in a righteous crusade against tyranny, soon became a tyranny itself. This, perhaps, is one of the most enduring and cynical lessons of Despenser's story. The vacuum of power is always filled, and the motives of those who seize it are rarely as pure as their propaganda suggests. Isabella and Mortimer's rule would last only a few short years before the young Edward III, coming of age, would violently overthrow them in his turn, executing Mortimer and forcing his own mother into a long retirement. In the long view of history, the legacy of Hugh Despenser the Younger is a complex and contested one. The chronicles of the time, written by the victors, paint him as a monster, a sodomite, a demon in human form who bewitched a weak king. This narrative, reinforced by the grotesque nature of his execution, has largely defined his image. Some modern historians have attempted a more nuanced view, suggesting that he was, at his core, a ruthlessly efficient administrator whose misfortune was to serve an ineffectual king. They argue that his methods, while extreme, were not entirely out of step with the brutal political culture of the 14th century, and that he became a convenient scapegoat for all the failures of Edward II's reign. There is perhaps a sliver of truth in this. Despenser was undoubtedly competent. His crime was not incompetence, but a terrifying hypercompetence yoked to an ambition that recognized no limits. The debate over his character, however, often misses the more fundamental point that his execution made so vividly clear. Whether he was a monster or a Machiavellian genius, the fact remains that the political establishment of England, from the highest baron to the London merchant, came to believe that he had fundamentally broken the contract of governance. He had not just enriched himself. He had privatized the very essence of the state, merging his personal will with the sacred authority of the king. He had made himself indispensable and, in doing so, had made himself intolerable. The public propaganda of his day, showing him in portraits with demonic claws, captured a symbolic truth, if not a literal one. He was seen as something unnatural, a parasitic growth on the body politic that had to be surgically and savagely removed. The ultimate tragedy of Hugh Despenser is one of classical hubris. He was a man of immense talent and drive who flew too close to the sun, not on wings of wax, but on the borrowed wings of a king. He failed to understand that in medieval England, power, even royal power, was a negotiated arrangement, a delicate balance between the crown and the powerful men of the realm. By attempting to create an absolutist state centered on himself, he shattered that balance. His execution was the system violently righting itself. It was an act of political necessity dressed in the language of moral justice. The scattered pieces of his body were a message, not just to future royal favorites, but to anyone who might forget that in the great Game of Thrones, no single player can ever be allowed to own the board. In the end, the story of Hugh Despenser the Younger is a profound and grisly meditation on the nature of power, ambition, and memory. He built an empire of parchment and fear, of forfeited lands and extorted confessions, believing it to be invincible. But its foundations were hollow, resting on the fragile will of a single, inadequate man. When that support failed, The entire structure came crashing down in a storm of retribution. His spectacular, ritualized death was not an act of simple vengeance, but a desperate and deliberate attempt to erase a historical anomaly. They scattered his body to ensure he could never be put back together again, either physically or historically. And in this, they largely succeeded. There is no tomb for Hugh Dispenser, no monument to his power. His legacy is the horrifying account of his end, a cautionary tale written in blood and fire, a testament to a man who gained a kingdom and, in the process, was so thoroughly unmade that he became little more than a ghost haunting the margins of history, a name synonymous with tyranny and a body that was never allowed to rest.